Welcome to the June meeting of the Wawenoc branch of the Ohio. You can see where I used to come from, Maine Genealogical Society. We're going to take over Ohio next year. But my name is Rick Davis. I'm the president of this group and not so eloquent spokesperson, obviously. And I want to again welcome you all here. One of our former staff members from the library is here with us, and she said she didn't recognize a lot of the people. I said, well, I don't recognize half the people here either, but I'm glad you're all here. And I'm sure it'll be an entertaining program, but I've got a couple little businessy kinds of things to do first. One is that back in the days, BC, that's before COVID, we used to, about every year or two, take a field trip. Often we went to the state library a couple times. We went down to Portland to the Historical Society. We went to the state archives and saw original 17th century documents. Because you get special tours, you see, if you have an in. Anyway, we're considering having our July meeting being a field trip to the state library in its current location, which is still a temporary spot that they've been in before COVID. And so I'd like to just take a little quick poll. How many people here would be interested in carpooling and taking a field trip to Augusta to see the state library? A few reluctant hands. Okay. That's what we used to do. We would carpool and then we would get a special tour and it would give you some time to do your research. And then often we would break for lunch. Of course, in the old place, we could go right over to what's the name of the Cobb? With the cafeteria. Yeah. But we'll figure something out if we go. So, all right, well, we'll keep that in mind then, because that was a pretty good, so like you've now all committed yourself to going. Because we don't want to have two people up there and say, well, the other thing is I brought a book to give away. This is the second edition of something called the Official Guide to Ancestry.com. Might be useful, especially for people that are new subscribers to Ancestry.com. I would caution you that this is the 2008 edition. So, they've changed a few things around and, they do that every few years, just sort of like when they do in Hannaford. You move everything around so people buy more because they don't know where stuff is. At any rate, this book is available to anybody that might be interested in having it. To anybody ready to jump at it? I'm not seeing a lot of hands. Well, see me afterwards if you change your mind. And with all of that, I've eaten up about 5 minutes of Dana's time. So I will just say Dana Murch's programs are always interesting and amazing. So I'll turn it over to Dana.
So as many of you know, I am currently researching and writing a book on the history of the entire Murch family of Maine, appropriately called All Things Murch. In the course of that research, I've discovered many amazing stories. Some of these stories are amazing in the sense of being astonishing or surprising or impressive. Some are amazing simply because they were recorded and we can read about them. Okay. A couple of 100 years after the fact. And some are amazingly false. So I'll begin at the beginning, and my thanks go to Steven Spielberg, Amazing Stories, which was a television series in, I think, the 1980s. So we'll begin at the beginning with my 7th great-grandfather, the immigrant, Walter Murch. Now, a word about why I call this Annals from this Tales from the Annals of a Murch Family. I have identified all of Walter Murch's descendants through 5 generations, 673 people, who, with the possible exception of Walter and his wife Deborah's 4 kids, all 673 of those descendants were born in the state of Maine. The first one born outside of the state of Maine that I can prove was a woman named Sarah Lewis, born in 1812 in Chatham, New Hampshire. Now, what's interesting about Chatham is the only roads into and out of Chatham are through Maine. It's right on the border. Her father was a Baptist preacher and taught in various places in New Hampshire and southern Maine. Preached, rather. The first Murch born with that name outside the state of Maine was Josephine Murch, born in 1854. Turns out that's 140 years after the immigrant came to Maine, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father was a ship captain from Hamden, Maine, and had a dock on the Brooklyn side of New York. So to begin, in 1726, Walter Murch submitted a deposition regarding a boundary line that he witnessed being run out in the town of York in southern Maine in April of 1715, in which it says he was 45 years old, which means he was born in about 1681. Then from the town of York record books, I found 2 grants of land to Walter Murch. Move this so I can read this. At a legal town meeting holden at York, March the 8th, 1714/15, granted unto Walter Murch 20 acres of land if he can find it clear of all former grants and settle in this town. And the one at the bottom, March the 13th, 1715/16, at a legal town meeting holden in York, granted unto Walter Murch 10 acres of swamp. Don't know why you'd want swamp, where he can find it clear of all former grants. Now, a word about the dating. Until 1752, the English used 2 different calendars. The old style calendar had the year start on March the 25th. The new style calendar, which is what we use today, the year started on January the 1st. So everything between January and March became double dated. And that's why you see 14/15. It would be our 1715. So I know Walter Murch was in York by March of 1715. I can find no prior record of him, so I don't know if he first came to Massachusetts and then to Maine, or simply went straight to York. But since ships didn't cross the Atlantic during the winter, he must have been either in Maine or Massachusetts, at least by the fall of 1714. So then the questions were, where did he come from and what did he do? On the screen is a marriage record from St. Werburgh's, which is a village church in Wembury in Devonshire on the southwest coast of England. And it says, Anno Domini 1700, December the 3rd, Walter Murch and Deborah Cornish. And it says Walter after that. So Walter was the son of a Walter. A later York County deed establishes that the Walter Murch of York did have a wife whose name was Deborah. And the kids were born between 1703 and 1709. So the marriage of 1700 works, but I have no birth records for those kids. Walter and Deborah are pretty common names. Murch is very common in Devonshire, as we'll see. So this may be their marriage record. I just can't prove it. The first available every name census in England was taken in 1841. And at that time, there were 533 individuals with the surname Murch who were named in the census, and over 70 of those people were born in Devonshire. So the chances of Walter Murch coming from Devonshire are really good. So what did he do? This is a deed from York County, December the 23rd, 1723. William Pepperell sold to Walter Murch his son-in-law, John Phillips, and his two sons, William and John, all of York, fishermen. They, in fact, were cod fishermen. And other records established that Walter Murch and his sons bought supplies from and furnished codfish to William Pepperell. William Pepperell, who's shown on the right, was a fish trader and a ship merchant in Kittery. By the time of his dealings with the Murch family, he was one of the wealthiest men in New England. And on the left is his house, which still stands at Kittery Point. His son, who was also named William, would become famous for leading a successful colonial expedition to capture the French fort at Louisburg on Cape Breton Island in 1745, for which he would become the only colonial made a baronet by the English monarch. He was henceforth known as Sir William Pepperell, and turns out bought most of what is today the cities of Biddeford and Saco. The Pepperell family has been described as Maine's most prolific and infamous owners of black slaves. They were also loyalists during the Revolutionary War, who had their land confiscated after they fled to England at the end of the war. The next story is William Murch, son of the immigrant Walter, who was my sixth great-grandfather, probably born in Devonshire, in England. So at the top is a marriage record from the York Vital Records. It reads, William Murch and Tabitha Young, both of this town, intend marriage, entered July the 23rd, 1723, and a little script underneath that says they were married August without a date. So remember that July 23rd and 1726 and sometime in August 1726. The bottom is the birth records for their children. And number one is Joanna Murch, born September the 4th, 1726. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that Tabitha was about 8 months pregnant, and it didn't take the local officials long to figure it out either. Less than a month after Tabitha gave birth to her first child, she was indicted for fornication. Notice it wasn't William who was indicted. She was then hauled into court. Tabitha Murch of York appeared to this court to answer a presentment of the grand inquest, a grand jury, exhibited against her for fornication. She, owning the fact, saith that William Murch, who is now her husband, is the father of said child. The said William Murch, also appearing, owned the fact, so they weren't hiding anything. And it's considered by the court that the said William and Tabitha received 7 stripes each on their naked back at the post and pay court fees of 12 shillings or pay a fine of 30 shillings plus court fees and stand committed until sentence performed, which means they were thrown in jail. There's no record of whether they paid the fine or took the beatings, but this was fairly typical. By 1630, William Murch had moved his family to Saco and become a farmer. The History of Biddeford and Saco was published in 1830 and is an absolute goldmine. In that history is the story of an event that occurred in 1747 during King George's War, the third of the so-called French and Indian Wars. And I'll read the better part of this because it's hard to. A few days after, so this is April of 1747, Mr. Nathaniel Eliot and his sons, who lived at the falls, that's on the western side of the river, so that's the Saco Falls in downtown Biddeford, Saco, were attacked in a field a short distance below the present lower meeting house in Biddeford. Mr. William Murch dwelt at that time nearly where his grandson, Captain William Murch's house now stands, on the road leading from Kennebunkport, which was not then laid out. There was, however, a private way from the Pool Road to Murch's. The Pool Road is the road from downtown Biddeford to Biddeford Pool on the coast. The Elliots were returning on this path with a load of hay, which they had obtained from Murch, when the Indians fired upon them and immediately killed the old man. The son, it is said, might have escaped, but exasperated by the fall of his father, he leveled and discharged his gun at the enemy and then took flight. He had not run far when another fire brought him to the ground. The bodies of the unfortunate persons were afterward found on the spot where they fell and decently buried. And this is racist, but it was written in 1830. The savages proceeded to Murch's and took him prisoner near his barn, when they decamped without committing any further injury. They carried Mr. Murch to Canada by the route of the White Mountains, whence he returned the following season, probably ransomed as a prisoner of war with someone that the Americans were holding. So bent on mischief were these Indians that they cut out the tongues of Murch's cattle. What's amazing to me is that story survives. The next amazing story is that of John Murch, a third-generation descendant of the Murch family. He was born in Biddeford, 1739. In 1757, he served as a private in a militia company that saw service at Narragansett No. 1, now Buxton, Maine, during the last French and Indian War. In 1761, he married Elizabeth Day and had 4 children born at Biddeford before moving to Township No. 1, east side of the Union River, almost at the bottom of the peninsula that is today Trenton. John Murch and the other settlers in what would become Trenton were squatters. This was fairly common along the coast and basically anything north of, say, a line drawn across from Gorham. Following the end of the Revolutionary War, they were living in fear that the lands they occupied and had improved would be granted to others, or that they would be forced to pay large sums to get title to these lands. Enter the geopolitics of the 18th century. It turns out that the French had a claim to Mount Desert Island, which lies just south of Trenton. In 1688, King Louis XIV had granted the island of Mount Desert to Antoine de Cadillac for military services rendered in North America. Cadillac, for whom the highest peak on the island is named, died without taking possession of his land. Fast forward through the Revolution. In 1786, 3 years after the end of the Revolution, Cadillac's granddaughter, Marie-Therese de Gregoire, and her husband came to Massachusetts and made claim to the island through inheritance of her grandfather. Both Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette interceded in their favor with the Massachusetts government in light of the indispensable aid that France had given to the colonial cause during the Revolutionary War. And so it was that the Massachusetts General Court issued 2 land grants to the de Gregoires. The first to the entire eastern half of Mount Desert, including all of Bar Harbor, and the second to all lands in present-day Trenton and Ellsworth on the east side of the Union River, provided that the de Gregoires worked with the squatters there to quiet their title to the lands that they occupied. And so it was that in one of the very earliest deeds recorded in Hancock County, the de Gregoires sold to John Murch 300 acres of land on the easterly side of Oak Point. And there's a dot that shows where that land was and where John Murch is in fact buried, in consideration of 15 Spanish mill dollars in hand paid by John Murch, and in further consideration that the said John Murch and his 2 sons are settlers on the land here demised. I think that's an amazing story. And we're not done with John. John's first wife, Elizabeth, had 6 children before she died in 1805. The following year, 67-year-old widower John Murch of Trenton married 30-year-old Charity Cook of Sullivan. John would have another 6 children with his second wife, the last of whom was born when he was 79 years old. Now, there are amazing things that happen when a man has a child when he's 79 years old. John's last child, whose name was Charity Cook Murch, was born in 1818. Her first child was born in 1839, 100 years after the birth of her father. Charity's last child was born in 1855, 116 years after the birth of her father. And there's more. The last grandchild of Charity, who was John's daughter, name was Georgia Frances Moore, died in 1985, 167 years after the birth of her grandmother, and 245 years after the birth of her great-grandfather, John. Now, let me put that all in some perspective. On my paternal side, my grandfather, Arthur Murch, was born in Belfast in 1888. I was born in 1952. I'd have to live another 31 years for there to be 167 years between my grandfather's birth and my death. Now I'll be 102. Meredith says I'm not going to make it past 90, so I might make it. But the firstborn of my great-grandfathers was Victor Aronson, was born in Sweden in 1851. I would have to live another 74 years for there to be 245 years between my great-grandfather's birth and my death. I promise, Meredith, it won't happen. And one more amazing story about John that it turns out is not true. I've talked about Charity Cook Murch. She died in Ellsworth in 1907 at the age of 89. She had a lengthy obituary published in the Ellsworth American. In discussing her father, the obituary reads in part, John Murch, born in Saco in 1839, when 18 years of age, in 1757, if you remember that date, he joined Wolfe's army, which captured Quebec in 1759, and was one of those who helped set the colors and carry the field pieces up the cliffs. Well, indeed, in 1759, during the last French and Indian War, the British army of General James Wolfe was besieging the French city of Quebec on the St. Lawrence. Winter was coming. They'd been in a stalemate for some months, and something needed to happen. The British found a way to get troops and cannon up the cliffs, just upstream from Quebec. And on September the 13th, British forces met the French army of the Marquis de Montcalm on the plains of Abraham above the city. The result of the battle was a British victory that basically signaled the end of French control in Canada and North America. I've read several books about the war. I've consulted with military experts. Everybody unanimously agrees there is no way an 18-year-old colonial militiaman from Biddeford, Maine, was with the army of General Wolfe scaling the cliffs above Quebec. The year is right. He was in 1747 in the colonial militia and served in Buxton. So this is just an illustration of how stories can get mangled. One might say embellished over the course of many years. The next amazing story is Simeon Murch, born in Gorham, 1769. He married Rachel Payne, a native of Eastham, Mass, and a descendant of Mayflower passengers William and Mary Brewster, Stephen Hopkins, and Stephen's daughter Constance. She was also a cousin of Robert Treat Payne, who signed the Declaration of Independence. After having 2 children in Gorham, Simeon and Rachel moved to the Maine wilderness. Now, I know this because their story, when they moved in 1794 to what is now Unity, was told in 1909 by their grandson and published in the History of Unity. At the time my grandfather, Simeon Murch, moved into Unity, The country was an unbroken forest east of Belfast, so that people were guided by blazed lines, spotted trees. The method of moving was unique, but neither comfortable nor convenient. As there was no road, the only means of travel at hand was on horseback. A strong bed tick, which I understand to be a mattress, was fixed astride the horse's back, furniture packed on each side, the load completed by putting father, a year and a half old, on one side, and older sister on the other side to balance. Thus they moved from Gorham to what is now the town of Unity, grandfather walking on one side of the horse and grandmother on the other. Now, what this story doesn't say is you're going from southern Maine, the bottom blue dot, to Unity, the upper blue dot. You have to cross at least 5 major rivers: the Presumpscot, the Royal, the Androscoggin, the Kennebec, and the Sebasticook. And they likely crossed with something like this. This is a horse-drawn toll ferry from Lincoln, which is north of Bangor, taken in the early 20th century. But back in the day, if you were just a person or two people, and you wanted to get from one side of the other river to the other, you go to the ferry, and the ferry was often a canoe. I mean, someone would paddle you over. The ferryman lived on one side. If he happened to be at his home and you're on the other side, you had to wave or flag him down or ring a bell or something, and he'd paddle over and get you. If you've got a horse with a bed tick and 2 kids, you're going to cross on a raft. The raft would have an overhead line so that it wouldn't, drift upstream or downstream too much. A rope attached to each end, and on each shore was a horse. So you got on one side, got your horse on, they'd get the horse going the other side, and they would haul you across the river. So they did this at least 5 times, besides walking 100 miles. The published story continues. Upon arriving at their destination, they found a small opening in a log house which grandfather had provided the year before. Here they began life in the wilderness. They had not to wait long for food, for beans, potatoes, and other vegetables could be used as soon as grown, but corn, before it could be used, had to be converted into meal. And there being no mill nearer than Winslow, which was 25 miles away, it had to be carried through the woods to be ground. A number of neighbors would go together, each taking a bushel of corn on his shoulders. They traveled a distance of 18 miles, it says, each way to the mill. They stayed in the mill all night and returned the next day with the meal. And we think life is hard. The next amazing story is my 3rd great-grandfather, Lewis Cobb Murch. Born in Hamden, 1801, moved with his parents and his siblings to Castine in 1805. Lewis was a 13-year-old boy in Castine when the British invaded and briefly occupied the town during the War of 1812. Lewis later married Lois Coombs of Islesboro in 1925, and Debbie Bird and I are Coombs cousins. Shortly afterward, moved to Belfast, where he operated a business making and repairing blocks and mechanical bilge pumps for sailing ships. And for those of you who aren't sailors, a block is that wooden pulley with metal parts in it that are all over sailing ships. And on the right is the schematic of a mechanical wood and metal bilge pump, which all wooden ships needed to have. Lewis Murch died in Belfast in 1887. His death was reported in the August 4th edition of the Republican Journal. Mr. Lewis C. Murch of this city died at his home on Thursday last, aged nearly 86 years. He came to Belfast almost 60 years ago and has carried on the business of block making here. Mr. Murch was a boy in Castine when on the 1st of September, 1814, General Goslin, in command of the British forces, took the town. The garrison fired 1 round, blew up the fort, and retreated. It was the boast of Mr. Murch that he was the first person that General Goslin addressed when he landed. Several boys had gathered about when the forces landed, and the general addressed the boy Murch saying, "Boy, where are the troops?" I can't do it with a British accent. In his old age, Mr. Murch was fond of telling of the incident, and many times has he repeated it in the journal office. Mr. Murch was a quiet, unassuming man and well-liked in his community. And I've often threatened Mayor, if that's what I'm going to do in my old age, I'm going to go to the Republican Journal office and talk about my genealogy till they kick me out. And the story of Lewis Murch continues. On October the 12th, 1865, just 6 months after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse during the Civil War, Lewis Murch's house and block shop on Spring Street, where the Star is, were among the structures that burned in the Great Belfast Fire. This plan of the burnt district is from Williamson's History of Belfast. So now Lewis and Lois needed a new place to live. They soon bought a lot running between Charles Street and Cedar Street. In the 1870 census, they listed as living on Charles Street. Now, as many of you know, the house that Meredith and I live in sits on the corner of Charles, James, and Cedar. And I wondered which house my great-grandparents, third great-grandparents lived in. All I had to go by was this photograph. My great aunt, in about 1976, identified all the people in this photograph. The two people seated are my third great-grandparents, Lois and Lewis. And I stared at this and said, boy, this looks awfully familiar. Diane knows what's coming. So I walked up to Charles Street with a photograph in hand, and lo and behold, it's the house next door to ours. It's the house that's currently co-owned by Cher Jones and Therese Bagnardi, and where Diane lives in the rent upstairs. So I was living next to my third great-grandparents and didn't have a clue. Next up is Simeon Cobb Murch. Born at Castine in 1825, he was the younger brother of my ancestor, Lewis. He married Mehitable Jordan and had 5 children. The 1850 census, he was listed as a block maker, 1860 census as a carpenter. Then came the Civil War. On April the 25th, 1861, only 13 days after Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter and started the war, Simeon Cobb Murch, who was 36 years old and the father of 5 children, all under the age of 18, enlisted as a corporal in the 2nd Maine Infantry. This photo is from the Castine Historical Society, was probably taken at the time of his muster because he has 2 stripes on his sleeve. In July, again, this is 1861, the 2nd Regiment participated in the First Battle of Bull Run, which was the first major battle of the war. In November, Simeon was promoted to sergeant. Now, in the day, the sergeant was the chief non-commissioned officer in a company, so this was a big deal. In May of 1862, the 2nd Maine was part of a Union force that engaged Confederate forces in a battle at Hanover Courthouse, located north of Richmond in Virginia. The 2nd Maine was credited with holding the Union line until reinforcements arrived to rout the Confederates. It was during that battle that Simeon Murch was mortally wounded. There's a gravestone in the Castine Town Cemetery with his name on it, but he is not buried there. The year following his death, his widow, Mehitable, received a widow's pension. In her pension file, which I got from the National Archives, is a handwritten letter from Simeon's company commander telling Mehitable of her husband's death. This is dated Encampment of the 2nd Maine, May the 30th, 1862. Mrs. S.C. Murch, it becomes my painful duty at this time to inform you of the misfortune which has befallen your devoted husband and a member who is highly esteemed in our little band. We were ordered forward to meet the enemy in the morning of the 27th instant and came in contact with them in the early part of the afternoon, and in which engagement your husband received a wound in his breast which proved mortal. He lingered until 1 o'clock the following morning at which time his sufferings and cares of this world were ended. During his last moments, he spoke occasionally of his family and seemed conscious of his situation until the last. His remains were properly buried with those of others who fell, and the spot marked by a board with his name, age, date of death, and battle inscribed on it. To the best of my knowledge, that body has never been recovered and moved to a national cemetery. So he's buried somewhere near Hanover Courthouse in Virginia. We done all that we could for him to the last, and all that circumstances would allow after his death. I have in my possession some few articles taken from his person, which I will send you by first opportunity. Allow me to tender you my sincere sympathy and that of my command. In this your sad bereavement, and may you be enabled, through the blessing of God, to bear up under it. You have lost a devoted husband, a friend of the company, and a true soldier. Respectfully yours, C.W. Tilton. And it's amazing that that has survived. And the only reason we have it is that his widow needed to prove he died in battle. And this was her proof. She didn't have anything else. In the pension, in her pension file, in the archives, National Archives. And I have a copy. No, ordered it online. The next story is my second great-grandfather, Charles Augustus Murch. Born in Belfast, 1842, the sixth of seven children of Lois and Lewis, whom we met earlier. Charles became a blockmaker like his father. 1860, he married Frances Benner of Waldoboro. That's his photograph. Probably taken in about 1870, because I know his wife sat for a photo with their only child, thankfully, in 1870. So this was probably taken the same time. In 1862, 21-year-old Charles Augustus Murch enlisted in the 19th Maine Infantry. In July of 1863, the 19th Maine participated in the Battle of Gettysburg, where Charles was wounded by a rifle ball that passed through his left leg just above the knee. He was discharged by reasons of a surgeon's certificate of disability, for which disability he subsequently received a pension. His attending physician was Dr. Edward Small of Belfast, wrote that Charles' wounded leg was unreliable and that it was difficult for him to walk on rough ground, get in or out of a carriage, or walk any distance. After the war, Charles worked at various local sawmills and gristmills. Then by 1884, he was employed as a foreman at the Pierce Ice Harvesting Company on the Goose River, right near the mouth. Then tragedy struck. The event was later recounted in an affidavit prepared by a co-worker, which I found in his widow's pension file. Oops. There. On the 8th day of January, 1884, we began to cut and store ice for the season. About 8 a.m., Murch and I were employed, and in passing from the ice house toward the elevator near the slide, which was about 10 feet high, a block of ice had stopped in the slide. So they would cut the ice, put them on a conveyor belt, go into a sawdust shed where they'd pack them so they wouldn't melt. When another block of ice came from the elevator and struck the ice in the slide with such force that a piece of ice weighing about 10 pounds was broken off and flew towards where Murch and I stood. When Murch saw the danger, he exclaimed, "Look out for the ice," and at the same time endeavoring to get out of the way of it by grasping his lame leg by his hands, as he had not the strength in his leg to raise it out of the snow. But this slight delay cost him his life, as the ice struck him on the head, from which injury he died about 12 hours later, after surviving a musket ball through the knee at Gettysburg. His widow successfully applied for and received a pension because she was able to prove that his death was in part related to his war injury. That's the only way she got a pension. Next up, Simeon Augustus Murch, born at Castine in 1881. By 1902, 21-year-old Simeon Augustus Simi Murch was a professional baseball player. He played various infield positions for several minor league teams in the New England League between 1902 and 1913. There was no minor league system then. There were these area leagues, which was where the major league scouts would go to find talent. He also played a total of 23 games in the major leagues for the St. Louis Cardinals and the Brooklyn Superbas, who would become the Brooklyn Dodgers. I'll talk about the photo in a minute. In 1904, the Nashua Telegraph of Nashua, New Hampshire reported that Simi Murch is the sensation of the league at second base. This is Simi's regular position, and there are few superiors in the league to him. 2 years later, 1906, the Sporting Life reported that Simi Murch comes pretty near being one of the most valuable all-around men in the league. And also in 1906, Simi Murch was credited with turning an unassisted triple play, in which one fielder records all 3 outs in an inning in a single play, which it turns out is an extremely rare feat. According to Wikipedia, there have been only 15 unassisted triple plays in the major league's 150-year history, making this a feat more rare than a perfect game when you pitcher pitches to 27 batters and gets them all out. Whoop. Okay. Little interlude. Come on. Oh. So an unassisted triple play almost always has to be turned by a middle infield. And you've got to have runners on at least 2 bases to get 3 outs. Let's see if I can pull this off.
All right, it's the top of the third. Runners on first and second, nobody out. Batter digs in at the plate. The runners take their leads. Here comes the pitch. The runners are off for the pitch. There's a line drive, snagged by Simi Murch behind second base. He runs to second for the out there, and then he tags the runner coming from first for the third out, a triple play. Can you believe it?
That's how it can happen. Come on. It turns out that Simi Murch blew out his knee, retired from semi-professional baseball, and then became the longtime baseball coach at Phillips Exeter Academy. I have his bio if you're interested. And for those of you who are baseball nuts, that is his Major League Baseball card. The Superbas became the Brooklyn Dodgers, moved to Los Angeles, and in 1990 celebrated 100 years of the organization and printed a card for everyone who ever wore a uniform of the Brooklyn Dodgers or the Superbas. So, and finding a baseball player is like having a minister or a lawyer in your family. I mean, there's just so much information out there. It's mind-boggling. Next up is Annie Gorgeous Murch. Annie was born in Portland in 1863. In 1883, after having vowed to never change her name, but more about that later, Annie married her 4th cousin, George Albert Murch of Hamden. So she never did change her name. Annie and George were both 7th-generation descendants of immigrant Walter Murch, and Murch cousins marrying Murch cousins is a thing. Both Annie and George were descendants of Mayflower passengers Stephen Hopkins and his daughter, Constance. Now, there wouldn't be anything amazing about this were it not for the circumstances of Annie's birth and the published story about those circumstances. In 1938, the Portland Sunday Telegram ran a lengthy feature story about then 75-year-old Annie Gorgeous Murch. It began, a little old lady who never cries anymore about anything, gazes upon the gray place where she was born from an upper window in her home on Peaks Island, and sees with her mind's eye a vast procession of men and women and events that have made American history. She is the only person ever born in Fort Gorgeous, and her name is Annie Gorgeous Murch. So here's her story. Fort Gorgeous was designed and built by Reuben Staples Smart, a master mason and construction engineer from Swanville. And Sarah Hayes lives in a house that's associated with the Smart family. I don't remember the exact connection. Reuben Smart's right-hand man on Fort Gorgeous was another master stonemason, John Murch of Hamden. John had moved to Portland with Reuben to work on the fort and soon married Reuben's daughter, Valerie. The new fort was intended to protect the approaches to Portland Harbor. Construction began in 1858 and was substantially complete by the end of the Civil War in 1865. Annie Gorgeous Murch was born March the 18th, 1863, in a little cottage-style house inside the fort. Her father died in the same little house 18 months later of typhoid fever, probably from drinking contaminated water. Annie then moved with her mother to South Portland. Annie's story then continues, and this is an example of how time can alter the truth. Annie was only 18 months old when their father died, but Annie Gorgeous Murch remembers the stories that were told about him. One was that he was captured by Indians out west when he was a young man. Well, as we know, there was a Murch captured by Indians. It is, in fact, one of her ancestors, William Murch, who was captured in 1747. Her father grew up in Hamden. And his father was a ship captain. John Murch stayed in Hamden until he went to work on Fort Gorgeous. So he was never captured by Indians out west. And she remembers the deeds, the great deeds of her grandfather, Colonel Reuben Staples Smart, who built Fort Gorgeous and Fort Preble, Fort Knox and Penobscot Bay, and other old stone fortifications like them, all the way from Maine to the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, true. Reuben Staples Smart built many lighthouses and forts, including Fort Knox, up and down the East Coast. The story then goes on. It goes back down the years to the days before the American Revolution, when Murches and Smarts hereabouts were building blockhouses and fighting Indians and breaking the new land in. There was William Murch, who came with his wife, Hannah, from New Hampshire, just after the Revolution, with the first group of 10 families to settle in Hamden. William fought the British in 1812. Well, not exactly. There was a William who married a Hannah that came from Gorham, not New Hampshire. They were among the earliest settlers of Hamden, but this William didn't fight in the War of 1812. He fought in the American Revolution, several short enlistments. And if you want to know more, there's a book on the forts of Maine published in 2013. And Annie's story continues. When she was a little girl in South Portland, Annie Gorgeous Murch came home crying bitterly one day, and her grandmother asked her what was wrong. "The other children plagued me," the little girl whimpered. "They teased me because they said I haven't any father." Her father died when she was 18 months old. Her grandmother sat down and took the sobbing child in her lap. "Now," she said, "let me tell you what a fine man your father was. And he has given you one thing in particular, one thing you must always cherish and be proud of. He has given you your name." The little girl thought it over and decided it was a pretty fine thing to be Annie Gorgeous, daughter of John W. Murch. She resolved to do nothing in her life that would hurt that name. And she became so zealous about it that at length she boasted about her family name before the other youngsters and declared staunchly she would never change her name. And of course she didn't. She married a Murch. And just so you know, I am keeping on the time-honored family tradition of marrying a cousin. Meredith and I are indeed eighth cousins. And to conclude Annie's story, she has lived through hardships and sadness which would have broken weaker spirits. But, says the granddaughter of old Reuben Staple Smart, I haven't known how to cry since I was a child. There have been times, she will admit, when I really have not cared about living. Death is just the step, I feel. But, and her eyes twinkle again, now I begin to want to be here to see the top blow off. For Annie Gorgeous Murch, who has seen much history in her 3/4 of a century, has an idea that the country will see political fireworks that will make more history in the 1940 elections. She wants to be here then to see the show. And of course, this suggests she was a pretty ardent Republican. Franklin Roosevelt won an unprecedented third term to the White House in 1940, so she didn't get her way. Now comes an absolute complete surprise. So I'm poking around the internet one day and quest for all things Murch. Mount Murch, located in Antarctica, 1,100 meters high, mapped by the U.S. Geological Survey from 1956 to 1966, named for Paul L. Murch, a cook at Palmer Station during the winter of 1966. Well, I didn't get terribly excited because there's a passel of other Murch families. There's one in Massachusetts that's not unrelated as far as I know. There's another in New York. There's a bunch in Canada. There are in fact so many that there is a website dedicated to the Murch family worldwide, created by Lulu Murch, whom I corresponded with, who lives in England and is descended from one of the Murch families of Devonshire. So I keep poking around online, and I find a personnel list for Palmer Station 1966, P.L. Murch, CN1 USN. That stands for a Culinary Specialist, First Class, United States Navy. So, okay, I start poking around to look for this Paul Murch. That led me to a Portland Press Herald notice from November the 29th, 1965. Come on. A North Baldwin native, Paul L. Murch, now residing in Chesapeake, Virginia, will be leaving early next month for the Antarctic aboard the Coast Guard icebreaker Eastwind. Paul, who is a Navy cook first class, will be stationed at Palmer Peninsula, where he'll be cooking for a small station. Paul was home earlier this month to visit his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Murch, and his brother-in-law and sister, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Crawford. While at North Baldwin, he shot a deer, which he took back to his Virginia home. With Paul on this trip to Maine were his two sons, also at home, Mrs. Murch and two daughters. Well, a little more sleuthing. Turns out that Paul Murch was born at North Baldwin in 1932, a ninth-generation descendant of the immigrant Walter Murch. Spent his career in the Navy and retired as a chief petty officer. After retirement, moved to Virginia Beach, where he died in 1999. So there is a mountain in Antarctica named for this family, which is pretty cool. Now I'll do a few short but amazing stories. As I say to people, this is a fabulous time to be a genealogist because I can sit in the comfort of my little study that Meredith doesn't come into and go find newspapers, online, digitized, searchable. I mean, this is a godsend. So these are some stories that I found just poking around. From the Bangor Daily Wigan Courier, October the 9th, 1858. During a severe thunder shower at Belfast on the 1st instant, the house of Mr. Joseph Carter in the outskirts of the town was struck by lightning. Mrs. Daniel Murch, who was passing the afternoon at the house, was sitting with one foot on the hearth of the stove and holding a child in her lap. The skirt of her dress and her underclothes were perforated with several large holes, her stocking on the foot resting on the floor rent to pieces, and her cloth gaiter boot literally torn to ribbons, yet she sustained no bodily injury. It is. I have as yet no idea who she is. It's 1858, so I've got another generation to go before I find her. From the Piscataquis Observer, December the 6th, 1883. A singular discovery was made last Wednesday by Walter Murch of East Eddington. Upon killing a pig 7 months old, he found a gold finger ring encircling its tongue about 2.5 inches from the end. The ring was almost hidden from sight by the tongue growing around it, and it seems almost impossible that it could have remained there without completely severing the tongue. The pig had appeared all right until Mr. Murch began to fatten him, when he found he would not eat corn nor even meal unless it was stirred up very thinly. The pig weighed 288 pounds, which is not much for a pig. The ring was worth $12 and was lost by Mr. Murch in the pigsty when the pig was 4 weeks old. You can't make this stuff up. And finally, from the Lewiston Evening Journal, March 30th, 1939. With one exception, the appointments made by the town selectmen Thursday in Brunswick occasioned a little surprise. But one exception more than made up for it. The town fathers apparently deciding to call his bluff, named William C. Murch, theater manager, to the post of dog catcher. He had been begging for the job several years, but each group of selectmen, realizing he was only fooling, ignored his request. Murch was undoubtedly the most surprised man in town on Thursday. And we could close with a little audience participation. Over the years, the Murch family spread from York County to the far reaches of the state of Maine. By the early 20th century, either a Murch descendant or the spouse of a Murch descendant had been born, married, lived, or died in every one of Maine's 16 counties. How many of you went to grade school, or as we say, elementary school in Maine? Okay. So you have to help me with the Maine County song, okay? And those of you from away, we'll do this twice. You can join in the second time. Whoops. This one. I need my middle C here. Mm-hmm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 16 counties has our state. Cumberland and Franklin, Piscataquis and Kennebec, Oxford and Muskegon, Waldo, Washington and York, Lincoln, Knox and Hancock, Saginaw and Somerset, Aroostook and Penobscot. So we'll do this. I want everybody now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 16 counties has our state. Cumberland and Franklin, Piscataquis and Kennebec, Oxford and Muskegon, Waldo, Washington and York, Lincoln, Knox and Hancock, Saginaw and Somerset, Aroostook and Penobscot. You're all now honorary members of the state of Maine. Yes, Diane. No. No. I'm sure there were, I can get this close here. There were many first and second cousins who were Murches who married. Some of them didn't have the name Murch, but it's clear they knew, the families knew each other. Meredith's family comes from Calais, and I traced it back as it turns out to be a loyalist family, a Dutch family from Manhattan. So I didn't hold out any hope of our being related. But her mother, who was from Waukesha, born in New York, Upper East New York, had one French Canadian line, a Fournier, and it turns out that's how we're related. I would guess, yes.
The deed that you showed in the beginning from the 1700s, where did you come across that?
In the York County Registry of Deeds.
So you went there in person snooping around?
Most of them are available through Family Search.
Hmm.
It's sometimes hard to use the indexes, but they are there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.